Welcome to today's WAP seminar on Make Work Fair. My name is Siri Shalazi. I'm a senior researcher at the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School and the co-author together with Iris Finette of Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results, the book that serves as the basis for this spring's seminar series. Every week, we feature researchers presenting their work, often based on randomized controlled trials that relate to the themes that we broadly cover in the book. And today we are thrilled to have with us Erika Kirgios talking about the themes of data and goals covered in chapters 2 and 3 of the book. She will be presenting on how diversity incentives can increase women's aspirations to lead. Erika Kirgios is an assistant professor in the behavioral science group at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Erika studies workplace inequality with a focus on field testing, theoretically grounded interventions that can improve outcomes for marginalized groups. She received her PhD in the Operations, Information, and Decisions Department at Wharton. A significant focus of Erica's research, and the one that she will be exploring today, is how gender diversity incentives affect women's aspirations to lead. So Erica will present for us for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I encourage you to submit any questions that you have throughout the presentation using the Q&A function on Zoom. I'll keep a close eye on that, and then I'll ask Erica all your questions. Thank you, Erica, so much for being with us here today. I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much for the warm introduction, and thank you for having me. I am going to share my slides. Can you see them okay? All right, great. So
Looks perfect.
as Sherry mentioned, I'm excited to share some work on the impact of diversity incentives on women's leadership aspirations. This work was conducted in collaboration with Edward Chang at HBS and with the help of More Than Now, which is a behavioral science consultancy in the UK. So Edward and I were really inspired to start this work by a series of headlines that I think we would probably be pretty surprised to see today, but were a little less surprising in 2021, that included headlines like this one about McDonald's starting a new allyship through accountability program in 2021 that included an initiative to hold executives accountable for progress on diversity-related goals. So essentially, they had decided that some of the CEO and executive team's annual compensation would be contingent on progress towards diversity metrics. And McDonald's was not the only major company doing this. American Express followed suit, as did some major pharmaceutical and energy companies. And Edward and I became very interested in the impact of what we were calling diversity incentives, or incentives that are paid out to members of an organization conditional on progress towards a measurable diversity-related outcome. And you might think of these as incentives paid out to CEOs and executives based on company-wide goals around representation of women or racial minorities in the workforce. You might also think of these as smaller incentives paid out to managers based on whether they hit a minimum number of mentorship hours for underrepresented group members in the organization. These can be quite broad, but we were interested in the impact of these kinds of diversity incentives. Now, when we thought about what might happen when a company institutes a policy like this, we looked at a lot of literature in behavioral economic on incentives and realized, yes, okay, incentives are almost certainly effective at motivating behavior. So when we think about how managers and organizational leaders will behave when these kinds of policies are in place, it should essentially increase the demand for DEI at organizations. It should increase people's efforts towards mentorship or hiring or promotion of underrepresented group members. And we know this, for example, from research on motivating people to go to the gym or to conduct health screenings. Providing incentives for these things can change behavior while the incentives are in place and can sometimes have lasting benefits even after the incentives are taken away. But when we think about those kinds of health incentive programs, there's a really key difference between those and diversity incentives. And that is that it's not just the person who's being incentivized who's in the firm, but also the target of the incentivized behavior. And we were curious about how diversity incentives would influence those targets, the women and racial minorities and other marginalized group members who might be hired or promoted or mentored because of the diversity incentive, or maybe not because of the diversity incentive, but under the presence of the diversity incentive, such that they're confused about whether they were selected because the incentive was in place or because of their own merit. And in particular, we were interested in this question in the context of women's leadership aspirations. So how would women's aspirations to lead, to become managers, to grow within their organization shift based on whether or not they were aware that their organization was instituting diversity incentives? We were interested in leadership aspirations because there is a really, really well replicated, robust gap in leadership aspirations, such that equally qualified women are less likely to say that they aspire to be leaders than men. They're less likely to apply for competitive opportunities, including opportunities to, be part of high potential programs or to ascend to management positions. And a large literature chalks this up to differences in preferences, essentially arguing that this is arising because men simply prefer leadership roles more than women do. Maybe it's because women have more, need to dedicate themselves to labor outside of the workplace, like taking care of their children or taking care of elderly parents. Or it's simply because women don't see themselves in leadership roles. Maybe they see them as misaligned with their values and their identity. And certainly this could be part of the story. But there is also a literature that suggests that this gap in leadership aspirations is driven by concerns about your likelihood of success. That essentially women are very worried that they are less likely to be selected for leadership positions, even if they claim to aspire to those positions. And this comes from two pathways. One is that internalizing stereotypes can lead to biased self-assessment, such that women believe that they are less qualified than objectively equally qualified men. They might think that they are less suited to the role of leader, not because of their preferences, but because of their assessment of their own ability. And the other path is about concerns about not being supported or about facing backlash, because we do tend to have prescriptive gender stereotypes that say that women should be less assertive, less ambitious, less agentic than men. And so when they behave in assertive, ambitious, and agentic ways by, for example, saying, I want to ascend in my organization, I want to be a leader, they might expect to face punishment for deviating from those gendered norms. So all of these paths can kind of lead to the gender gap in leadership aspirations, which might suggest that shifting confidence could be a fruitful way to boost women's willingness to apply to be leaders or to assert that they have a preference for management roles. So what we kind of were thinking about was a model in which women require a minimum level of belief in their own likelihood of success before being willing to express leadership aspirations. Maybe because they're particularly worried about rejection, they're particularly risk averse. They need to think, okay, I'm at least this confident that if I express my aspirations, they're going to be supported and I could be successful. So organizations that want to boost women's aspirations might need to increase their expectations of success. One way to do that would be by shifting their self-assessments, but those are pretty hard to move. It might instead be more fruitful to boost their expectations of receiving support and sponsorship, of having managers who will nominate them for high potential programs and will give them highly visible projects that can get them on the radar of the people who could select them for a promotion. What we think might be happening is that women essentially in organizational environments are operating as strategic actors, trying to assess whether their expectations should be high enough to warrant expressing their leadership aspirations. Essentially, they're trying to develop expectations of manager support with incomplete information. They're looking around for signals that they will or won't be supported. Now, the difficult thing is that in organizations and industries that are really male dominated, credibly signaling support for gender diversity could be very difficult for organizations. That's because, one, there's a very strong inconsistent signal that's simply coming up from the demographic makeup of the firm. If you look around yourself and most people are men and almost everybody in managerial positions is a man, you might start to think, okay, this is not a place where I can succeed. You're getting that strong signal that the prototype of a successful person here is a man. It's also true that maybe not right now, but at least in the last decade or so, there have been a lot of reputational sanctions for organizations that don't seem to care about diversity. So a lot of organizations were engaging in what we might call cheap talk, claiming a commitment to diversity that may or may not have actually been consistent with their values. And so it might be hard for women to parse in what situations those kinds of values-driven statements are supported by a real value for gender diversity and in what situations they're not. Now, if we look to the literature on signaling theory to think about how organizations could credibly signal that they'll support women, the strongest predictor of signal credibility is its cost. And that's in part because investments of time and money and effort and energy make signals harder to dismiss. It's less likely that you're engaging in cheap talk if you're really putting your money where your mouth is. And it's also the case that those that have the underlying quality that you're trying to signal should be more willing to invest in costly signals because for them, they will be less costly. Now, it's a bit of a complicated statement, so I'm going to break it down with a hopefully intuitive example. we think about signaling theory where it was devised, it's in the labor market. So organizations are trying to assess whether candidates are qualified or not for a job. And one thing that candidates do to signal that they are qualified is to invest in credentials, to invest, for example, in getting an MBA. Now, getting an MBA is clearly costly. It costs time and energy and effort. It's also the case that for highly qualified, highly skilled people, getting an MBA should be less costly. And that's in part because they might be qualified enough that they have scholarships, so it's literally cheaper in terms of financial investment. But it's also the case that those who are more qualified should have an easier time scoring well on tests and writing good essays and getting into the program and succeeding while they're in the program. So having the signal suggests that you are more likely to actually be qualified because it's easier for qualified people to get the signal. So now let's think about all of that in the context of diversity incentives. In the context of diversity incentives, they are quite literally costly signals of organizational commitment to women's advancement because they are tying monetary stakes to goal progress. These aren't just organizations that are saying, we value gender diversity, we care about women. These are organizations that are concretizing their goals and tying financial stakes to those goals. And it's also the case that firms that genuinely value women's advancement should be more willing to institute diversity incentives because for them, those incentives are cheaper in terms of a cost benefit analysis. Because if you're a firm that doesn't care about gender diversity and you institute an incentive program like this, you might have to pay the incentive and in return receive gender diversity that you don't actually care about. So you're paying money to get something you don't value in return. Whereas if you are a firm that does care about gender diversity, the cost benefit analysis might just work out because you're paying an incentive and in return you're receiving a valuable amount, something that you value, basically more women in the pipeline. So diversity incentives should meaningfully shift women's expectations of receiving support. Now, the incentive obviously is at the organizational level. So you might wonder, why would a diversity incentive also shift women's expectations that individual managers will support them? And we think this would happen for two reasons. One is that people tend to be attracted to organizations that reflect their values, which should suggest that managers are more likely to go to organizations that share their values. If the organization values gender diversity, so should individual managers, and they might be motivated to conform to the organizational norms and values that they see once they're there. But also managers could be either directly or indirectly incentivized. And by indirectly incentivized, I'm basically referring to the case where maybe managers aren't getting an incentive themselves, but their higher ups are, and they want to please their higher ups because they too want to ascend within the organization. So all of this should suggest essentially that diversity incentives should increase women's expectations of receiving support, which in turn should boost their expectations of success and increase their willingness to express leadership aspirations. Of course, at this point, I've painted a really rosy picture, and there are reasons to be pessimistic about the impact of diversity incentives on women's leadership aspirations. And in fact, the dominant narrative in the literature and organizational behavior would suggest the need for pessimism. And that's because there is reason to believe that identity conscious policies or policies that explicitly take into account people's identities, like affirmative action or diversity goals or diversity incentives, might cause identity threat. They might essentially suggest to, for example, the women being targeted by the policy that women can't succeed on their own in this firm, that instead they need these kinds of policies to get a leg up, and that if they succeed, it's because of their gender and not because of their individual merit. And this might undermine women's confidence and increase their concerns about facing stigma or being labeled as diversity hires, all of which should reduce their willingness to express leadership aspirations. People also have a fundamental intuition that intrinsic and extrinsic motives are misaligned. So they might wonder, okay, is this organization instituting a diversity incentive because actually their managers don't genuinely care about gender diversity and they need to be paid to care? And that might lead them to be more concerned about facing backlash and having managers who don't genuinely support them, won't give them the sponsorship that they need, or even if they do ascend to leadership positions, being unsupported by their direct reports. So all of that suggests that diversity incentives might decrease women's aspirations. So at this point in our thinking, we were wondering which would dominate. Is it the case that diversity incentives are this costly signal of support that increase women's willingness to say, I want to be a manager, I want to lead, I want to succeed here? Or is it the case that they would be demotivating and lead to identity threat and lead women to say, no, 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 this is not the right environment for me? So we wanted to test those two potential theoretical accounts across a series of experiments. I'll pause here in case there are questions before I dive into kind of the experimental overview in the first study.
Thank you, Erica. There's one which is not directly related to this particular study, but I think it's interesting to think about in terms of incentivization.
Mhm.
How might we incentivize companies and leaders themselves to care about women's advancement or about diversity, equity, and inclusion, such that they might want to implement these incentives in the first place?
Huh. That's a very good question, especially in the climate we're in now. I think we as you know, audience to organizations can kind of do what we have been doing, which has historically been motivating, which is have reputational sanctions when companies fail to care about diversity. And that has motivated a lot of organizations over the last decade or so. I think what's concerning is that that audience is becoming more and more divided and fractured as people diverge in their opinions of whether diversity is a good thing or a bad thing for organizations to pursue. And so that's kind of undermining our ability to motivate organizational leaders to pursue these kinds of policies. So, to the extent that we can create a more unified and strong voice that kind of reputationally sanctions or calls out organizations or boycotts organizations or whatever it is in our power to do as consumers, I think that's what we individually can do. There are things governments can do, but currently our government is doing all of the other things, not any of the things that would motivate pursuit of diversity goals. Um, but there are other governments around the world doing a much better job.
Thank you,
Not
Erica.
the most optimistic answer, I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'll talk about the series of studies where we disentangle these two hypotheses, and then we can come back at the end to this question about what we can do and what the times we're living in might suggest about this work. But our first field experiment was a field experiment at an engineering firm, which I'll describe very shortly. And then we followed that up with an incentive compatible online experiment, and then two experiments looking at mechanism evidence. So first, for our first experiment, we partnered with a large global telecommunications and engineering company headquartered in Europe that was seeking to increase the representation of women in managerial positions at the firm. This is an organization that overall is about 25% female, but when we started working with them, their management pool was about 21% women. And they were trying to increase the representation of women in managerial positions from 21% to 23% by 2024. This might seem modest, but this is a very large organization. They set this goal in 2021, so it was a pretty tight timeline to see a 10% change in the representation, the gender representation of their management pool. The other interesting thing is that they had decided that a portion of the C-suite executive bonuses would be contingent on reaching this goal, that basically some proportion of their executive bonuses at the end of the year in 2024 would be contingent on how much progress they had made in going from this 21% to this 2020 to this 23% figure. Now, when we started working with them, the thing that was really exciting was that the executives had decided this and they had not yet communicated this initiative with anybody else within the organization. So we got to step in at that point and see what the impact of communicating about these initiatives would be on women's aspirations. And in particular, we started working with this organization shortly before their yearly evaluation processes. So what we were able to do was embed information about the goal and the incentives in an email prompting all of the female employees in their Europe and Latin America offices to complete self-evaluations. So the way this company's annual evaluations work is that first employees complete self-evaluations and managers complete evaluations of them. Then the employee and the manager meet and they discuss the employee's progress over the past year. And based on their self-evaluations and their stated goals for the next year, they goal set and make a plan for the coming fiscal year. We randomly assigned women to one of three conditions that determined the content of the emails that they got, reminding them to complete their self-evaluations. In the control condition, they received no information about the internal goal and incentive. Instead, we simply reminded them of the organization's diversity values, and I'll show you what that language looks like on the next slide. In the goals only condition, we only gave them information about the diversity goal. And in the goals and incentive condition, we gave them information about the goal and the incentive. And now this design is important here because what we really wanted to do was isolate the impact of the incentive. What happens when you tie monetary stakes to diversity goals? And this allows us to separately assess what's the impact of goal setting and then what's the impact of adding that financial stake. And importantly, you can't really have an incentive without a goal because in order to pay out the incentive, you need to have a metric that determines success or lack of success. So I'll show you the language in the next slide. So our language appeared both at the beginning and at the very end of the email. And in between, it was all stuff reminding people how to access their self-evaluation forms, how to complete their evaluations, and what the evaluation process would look like. But at the very beginning, we said, as you're completing your annual performance evaluations and conversations, remember that Company X believes that diverse and inclusive teams drive performance. That was the only language about this in the control condition. In blue, in the goals only and goals plus incentives condition, we wrote, this belief is supported by a target to increase women's representation in line manager positions from 21% in 2021 to 23% by 2024. And in the green, we add, and executives are now incentivized to make sure we achieve this across Company X. So I've anonymized the company name here, but you get the point. In the control condition, you're just learning about these diversity values, and in the goals only condition about the goal alone, whereas in the goal and incentive, you also learn about the incentive program. Overall, about 2,000 female employees who are not at the manager level were randomized into conditions. We randomized them such that every female employee was in the same experimental condition as their manager and in the same experimental condition as all of the other women on their team reporting to that same manager. And we did this to make sure that when you sit down to have that conversation with your manager, you don't have different information about them, about the organization's policies and the presence of the incentive. So we were trying to reduce the impact of spillover effects by making sure everybody on the same team, including the manager, is getting the same information. Now, you notice that I talk about female non-manager employees. All male employees received the control email. This was something that the company felt very strongly about. So I'll talk a little bit about whether we see evidence of spillover, such that men maybe learned about the incentive and the goal from their female peers or from their manager, but we don't have a direct test in this study of how men react. I'll show you that in study 2. The primary dependent variable of interest is how these female non-manager employees responded to the question, I want to manage/continue managing others. Now, none of them are currently managing others, so for them, this basically boils down to, I want to manage others, which is coded as 1 if the employee says yes and 0 otherwise. And from our conversations with the organization, the way they seem to use this is to determine whether an employee wants to be on the management track. And this can happen a few years out from a promotion or in the year that they could apply for a promotion, and kind of determines their goal setting in the coming year with their manager. So here on the y-axis, you can see the proportion of female employees indicating a desire to be a manager. And on the x-axis, you see the experimental condition. In the control condition, about 43% of female employees indicated a desire to be a manager. This was not significantly affected by them learning about the diversity goal alone. But we do find a significant increase in women's stated aspirations in the goal and incentive condition. And in particular, we find about an 11% regression estimated increase in women's leadership aspirations when they learn about the incentive. And this is true both relative to the control condition and relative to the diversity goal alone condition, suggesting that this benefit is really coming from the presence of the incentive and not from concretizing their commitments more broadly. Now, we were wondering whether we would find evidence of heterogeneity, whether some women respond differently than others, but we found no evidence of moderation by employee tenure or job stage, which were pre-registered potential moderators. We also didn't find evidence of moderation by exploratory things that we played with, like the proportion of women on your team or your age. We also did not find any effect on women's self-evaluations. So we looked at women's stated self-perceived impact over the last year, and women aren't suddenly saying, oh, I had a much bigger impact when they learn about the diversity incentive. Their self-evaluations stay the same. And so this test suggests that to the extent that this is stemming from a difference in confidence, it can't be coming from your self-assessments. It's coming from your assessments of the environment around you, but we'll test that more directly later. We also find no difference in the quality of the women who aspire to leadership. So we used manager evaluations of the women to assess quality based on how managers evaluated their impact and their ability to take on challenges over the past year. And we found that the women who expressed aspirations to leadership were similarly qualified across conditions. So it's not like the diversity incentive is leading less qualified women to say, hey, I want to be a leader too. These are women who are qualified across all three conditions. Again, we didn't randomize men into a condition, but we can assess potential spillover or leaked information effects by seeing whether, based on the condition their manager is in, men behave differently, and we don't find any evidence of that. But of course, we didn't directly message men here, so we'll talk about men in the next study. But overall, what we find in this field experiment is that telling women about diversity incentives increased the likelihood that they expressed a desire to lead by 11% relative to the control condition, by almost 12% relative to learning about the goals alone. So I do want to pause here in case there are more questions before I get into study 2.
Erica, just a quick one to confirm. So in this study, do you have any information available on men's interest in management and leadership
Yeah,
roles?
so there were actually pretty similar to the women. Men were expressing an interest in leadership roles about 46% of the time. It wasn't actually significantly different from the control women or the goal and incentive women. It was kind of somewhere in the middle.
Thank you.
All right. So in study 2, we set out to conceptually replicate these field experiment results with an online incentive compatible experiment in which we were examining also how men responded to learning about the diversity incentives. This experiment included 915 participants on Prolific, which is an online platform for recruiting participants, for those of you who don't know what Prolific is. And all of these participants knew that they were going to be participating in an economic game for bonus money. So at the beginning of the study, they created gendered avatars using, a nickname and essentially a picture of either a male or a female that matched their gender on the survey platform. And they participated in 2 rounds of a number grid game, essentially a math game that's been used in prior behavioral economics experiments, looking at gender gaps and competition rates. In round 1, everyone was paid piece rate. They earned 10 cents per correct answer, and they solved as many problems as they could in 2 minutes. Before participating in round 2, they learned that this time they would have a choice. Either they could again be paid piece rate, where they earn 10 cents per correct answer, or they could apply to become a leader. If they applied to become a leader, managers would decide between 2 applicants, and they would have as information their gendered avatar, their nickname, and their performance in round 1. And managers' pay would be based on leader performance in round 2. And they learned that people who are selected to be leaders would be paid 20 cents per correct answer instead of 10 cents, and would be eligible for future higher paying leadership tasks. Whereas those who are not selected would earn 0 cents per correct answer. So it is a bit of a risky choice. We did this to kind of emulate that it can be costly to apply for management positions in organizations and fail to get them. Before deciding whether to apply, everyone learned that typically 32% of leaders are women, and this is a number that we pulled out from prior research. And they were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions that tried to mimic the conditions in study 1. In the control condition, we said, 32% of leaders are women, but we value gender diversity in our leadership pool and have told managers so. In the diversity goal alone condition, we say that's why we've set a target to increase the proportion of women in our leadership pool from 32% to 47%. And in the goal and incentives condition, we add, and all managers will earn a bonus if they collectively reach this target. So again, you're learning in the goal alone condition about this concrete specific commitment, and in the incentive condition, you're learning that financial stakes have been tied to that commitment. And the dependent variable of interest is whether participants apply to be a leader or not. So here on the x-axis, we see women and men, and I'll show you their application rates across all 3 conditions. Women in the control condition apply 46% of the time. In the diversity goal alone condition, again, their application rates are not significantly affected. But when they learn about the diversity incentive, women are significantly more likely to apply for leadership. For men, we see similar application rates. So here we actually did not replicate the gender gap in competition that we usually find with this paradigm. We were a bit surprised by that, but noise can happen. And again, men were unaffected by learning about the goal alone, but directionally, they were less likely to apply when they learned about the diversity goal and incentive. And if we look at men alone, that effect is not significant, but overall, there is a significant interaction such that when diversity incentives are communicated, women are actually applying to be leaders significantly more than men. So in study 2, we replicate and extend the findings from study 1, finding that there are benefits to diversity incentives in terms of women's leadership aspirations and willingness to enter competitive competitions for leadership. And we also find that directionally, but not significantly, men are negatively affected by the presence of diversity incentives. So it might be the case that our field partner in study 1 made a good choice by communicating this during a critical decision point with women, but not with men. But of course, this doesn't tell us anything about the mechanism. And I spent a lot of time at the beginning talking about why diversity incentives might be effective or ineffective at boosting women's leadership aspirations. And in particular, we suggested that diversity incentives could serve as a costly signal of managerial support or sponsorship and boost aspirations for that reason. So that's what we set out to test in study 3. Specifically in study 3A, we look at mediation evidence by measuring the process. And in study 3B, we look at moderation evidence by manipulating the process. So in study 3A, participants were 578 self-identified women who were asked to imagine a context very much like the one in the field experiment in study 1, that they were an employee at a large global engineering firm called NGINX, whose employees were roughly 25% women and 75% men. The annual evaluations were coming up, and that part of the annual evaluation process involved their decision about whether to tell their manager that they were interested in management roles or not. We randomly assigned them here to just one of 2 conditions, either the control condition, where we told them, as you're completing your evaluations, remember that NGINX believes that diverse and inclusive teams drive performance, or the diversity incentives condition, where we said this belief is supported by our new incentive program, which provides bonuses to executives based on whether they successfully increase women's representation in manager positions across NGINX from 19% in 2021 to 24% by 2026. So again, we're trying to emulate the experimental design from study 1. Now here we only included the diversity incentives condition just to maximize power because we weren't seeing any differences between the goals alone and the control condition in our other studies. We measured our primary dependent variable of interest, which was women's willingness to express interest in pursuing a promotion to their manager on a 7-point scale. And we also measured a mediator scale, expected managerial support, with items like my manager would help me attain desirable positions, my manager would use their influence in the organization for my benefit, my manager would use their influence to support my advancement in the organization. So first here we can see their willingness to express leadership aspirations on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, the 2 experimental conditions. And we replicate the effects from study 1 and study 2, where women are more likely to express leadership aspirations when they learn about the diversity incentive than when they do not. We also find evidence of mediation. Specifically, knowing about the diversity incentive boosts women expectations of receiving managerial support significantly, and this in turn is correlated with an increased interest in becoming a manager. And we find evidence of significant mediation. So this is some initial evidence via process measurement that part of what's happening here is that the diversity incentive is shifting people's perceptions of receiving support and therefore increasing their willingness to express aspirations. But we wanted to look at this again where we manipulate anticipated support and see what the impact of the diversity incentive is on top of that. So here we have 996 self-identified women on Prolific asked to imagine essentially the same scenario. They're at NGINX, they're doing their annual performance evaluations, they need to decide whether to ask for the promotion to manager. And we randomly assigned women to one of 4 conditions in a 2x2 design. Again, the control or diversity incentive condition as in study 3A. And then either a high support condition where we tell them your manager has a history of supporting female employees and helping them get management positions, or a low support condition where we tell them, although your manager has supported many male employees and helped them get management positions, your manager does not have a history of providing the same support to female employees. So what we're essentially shifting here is based on prior history, whether you have a strong pre-existing signal that your manager is likely to be supportive, or whether you have a strong pre-existing signal that your manager is likely to be unsupportive. And our theorizing would suggest that when your expectations of support are already high, the marginal benefit of the diversity incentive is going to be minimal. But when your expectations are low, diversity incentives should really be able to shift your expectations of how your manager will treat you and therefore boost your willingness to express leadership aspirations. So again, our dependent variable is how likely would you be to say you are interested in this promotion? And as I mentioned, our prediction is that diversity incentives will have a stronger effect on leadership aspirations for women in the low support conditions than those in the high support conditions. So here on the y-axis, you have willingness to express leadership aspirations, and on the x-axis, the low and high historical support conditions. And in the low support condition, we see that women are significantly more likely to express leadership aspirations after learning about the diversity incentive. Whereas in the high support condition, the effect of the diversity incentive is much more modest. In fact, it's only directional. And we find significant moderation based on whether expectations of support were high or low based on managers' historical behavior. So this provides some more evidence that part of what's happening here is that the diversity incentive changes people's expectations of how much support or sponsorship they're likely to receive from their managers. So overall, what I've shown you across these studies is that communicating diversity incentives to women can increase their willingness to express leadership aspirations, and that it doesn't do so by changing women's self-assessments. It's not like they're suddenly becoming more confident in their own abilities. Instead, it's changing how they expect to be treated within their organization. You're changing their perceptions of the organizational environment that they are in. And this could be particularly effective in organizations where women and have reason to anticipate low levels of support. So if you're an organization that really wants to change the way things work in relation to gender diversity, this could be a step to show that you really have the intention to follow through on new commitments. Importantly, one insight from this work is that it does suggest that the leadership aspiration gap can't simply be chalked up to a revealed difference in preferences across genders. Instead, what this work suggests is that the gender leadership aspiration gap is a strategic response to environmental cues, that women are going around trying to figure out how likely they are to be supported or not, and modulating their behavior accordingly. And that suggests that in order to create a more diverse pipeline, organizations should genuinely signal that they plan to support women and to support women's advancement. So practically speaking, this suggests that organizations that want to diversify their pipeline should consider using diversity incentives. But it also means that it's really important to follow through, because insincere commitments can ultimately be more damaging to women's perceptions and women's aspirations than simply making no commitments at all. More broadly, what this work suggests is that making signals of support for diversity more concrete and costly can help organizational credibility. But I do think that these things are kind of moving targets. Obviously, in the last few weeks, we've been working on this for a few years now. In the last few weeks, the climate in the US at least has shifted dramatically, and many organizations are backpedaling their DEI commitments. And that might suggest that in the current climate, even much more modest signals of support for gender diversity might be taken more seriously by women who are looking for any information suggesting that they're not in an organization that's going to kind of kowtow to these demands to eliminate DEI from the agenda. So I'm excited to maybe chat more about that as I take questions, but I wanted to thank you all for listening and thank More Than Now and Edward for their partnership.
Thank you, Erica, for this wonderful dynamic presentation and for this work, which is brilliant and really groundbreaking. And we're thrilled to have you here sharing it with us. I also want to thank everyone who has submitted really thoughtful and excellent questions in the Q&A. We will get through as many of those as we possibly can, but please do keep them coming. We're keeping a close eye on those on this end. So Erica, I'd like to start by picking up on something that you said toward the end here, which is that these dynamics we're seeing are a strategic response on behalf of women, not necessarily anything relating inherently to their confidence or their leadership aspirations. But Rati is asking, do we know anything about how high achieving these women are to begin with? Because we might expect that among women in an organization, there's a range of interest in leadership positions, in management, or just achievement orientation in general.
Yes, and so I don't want to claim that all women have aspirations to leadership, just like not all men have aspirations to leadership. And in fact, even in the diversity incentives condition, we're finding that 48% of women are expressing interest in management positions, not 100 or even 80%. And even among men, aspirations are at about 45.5%. So clearly, there are lots of people who simply aren't interested or might not feel ready to be managers. But what I will say is that we didn't find evidence of heterogeneity based on how high achieving these women were, based on their tenure in the organization, or based on which sub industry within the organization they were in, because within the organization you have some people who are engineers, some people who work in HR, so on and so forth. We found these effects were consistent across all of these buckets of women. So it doesn't seem like this is something that only works for the most high achieving ambitious women, or for women who are in the most male dominated subfields within the organization. This seems to work pretty broadly.
Thank you. Many of our listeners and viewers are also wondering about the effect of culture. You mentioned that this is a global company. So, how might this intervention work across different countries? Are we seeing any differences? And also, male dominated versus perhaps female dominated sectors or companies?
Yeah, so we've only run this in one company, so I can't say whether this is particularly effective because of this company's culture or not. But what I can say is the employees that we looked at were spread out across Europe and across Latin America, and we don't find differences based on where their office is located, and we don't find differences based on what sub-industry within the organization they're in and how male dominated that is. Of course, when we break this up into buckets, some of these buckets are quite small, so we might not be well powered to detect differences. So I don't want to make strong claims that, oh my gosh, this works across every culture. We didn't study every culture, and some of the cultures have small representation in the firm, or every industry. And I can't say that it works across every organization because we studied it in one organization. But I will say that our online survey participants are quite different than the women in STEM that we are studying in the field, in that they're mostly gig economy workers who aren't necessarily working in a male dominated sector, and most of them are in the US. And we still find the effect there. So we have some confidence in the generalizability of these effects.
Thank you. There's prior research, this is Daniela's question, that women are sometimes less likely to go into competitive environments and take risks in competitive environments. Are you at all concerned that incentives and the presence of incentives might signal a competitive environment that might perhaps introduce some of these other dynamics around gender and risk taking and raising your hand?
It's a really interesting question. We didn't measure perceptions of competitiveness. So I can't say conclusively if we are creating that kind of perception among women that this is suddenly a more competitive work environment. But if that were dominating, then I would have expected reduced willingness to express leadership aspirations, which we don't find. So to the extent that that's happening, it's probably not happening amongst the majority of women. Or it's overpowered by their perception that this is also an environment that's more likely to support them, which might be more important to determining their aspirations than concerns about competitiveness. But I can't say conclusively because we didn't measure it. So good question, good idea.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Thank you. We also have some questions about the incentives themselves. So, for example, comparing study one to study two, in study one, the target that the company set was going up by 2 percentage points, right, in terms of women's representation. In study two, that was closer to 15. Do you think that the actual size of the goal or the ambitiousness of the goal, how would that play into the results that you've reported?
Yeah, I think it feels very intuitive that this should be more powerful when goals are more ambitious, because it's a stronger signal that you intend to change things. Uh, but I will say that it's not quite an apples to apples comparison, because a 15% increase in a 1,000 person study in this online environment is a lot easier to achieve than a 2% increase in a global organization with tens of thousands of employees. And so I think it might be that those employees do recognize that this is actually a lofty goal for the organization, that it requires a lot of changes to be made in a short 3-year period. And maybe if they had said in the next 20 years, we want to go from 21 to 23%, it would have been less effective. So I think we didn't study any goals that were so unambitious as to be almost embarrassing or empty signals. But I do think if we had looked at that, this would be much less effective. I think the question of when the goals themselves work is also interesting, because we have some other work suggesting that goals can be effective at attracting organization entry, so increasing applications to an organization. And And I think that opens up really interesting questions about how strong a signal needs to be when you're already in an organizational environment and you have competing signals versus when you're an applicant and you know almost nothing. And so at that point, maybe even a weaker signal of support can be enough to say, okay, I want to apply here. This is a place where I should be.
This might be an interesting area for future research. Speaking of weaker signals, you mentioned toward the end of your talk that in the current climate, even more subtle signals from organizations about their commitment to advancing women might work. What might, in today's climate, some of those more subtle signals look like?
Well, I'm just thinking about the fact that I think Goldman Sachs and Ben and Jerry's made headlines. They made the New York Times for simply refusing to take the words diversity, equity, and inclusion off of their websites. And I think, 3 years ago, we would laugh at the idea that simply saying diversity, equity, and inclusion on your website would be meaningful. Because at that point, I think over 87% of Fortune 500 companies had a whole web page devoted to DEI. And now many organizations are scrubbing those words and replacing them with valuing difference and other softer terms that don't trigger the same reactions as DEI. And so even just saying, no, we're keeping this language in our website might be a strong enough signal, certainly strong enough that the New York Times wrote about it. And so probably also strong enough that employees see it as an act of resistance. I think one way that a signal can be costly is when it's risky. And if everybody else is doing something different, so you're non-normative by sticking to your horses and saying, no, we're keeping DEI language on our websites, that's risky. And so it becomes a costly signal in and of itself.
Yeah. Thank you. Staying with the current moment for just another moment, it seems that we are moving slightly away from performance being linked to, pardon me, compensation being linked to scorecard performance, key performance indicators, metrics, stuff like that, especially in the DEI and fairness space. How might your work speak to those organizations that are delinking compensation and incentives from metrics-based outcomes at this current time?
Specifically in the DEI space, I think it's concerning because I think across a whole body of my research, we find evidence that the more concrete the basically your signal or your commitment is, the more powerfully it affects people's sense of belonging, their belief that you're genuine, their willingness to apply, to stay, to seek leadership. So I think in terms of what it would do to historically underrepresented people in the workforce, yeah, it's looking rough. And I think maybe not every organization right now is prioritizing diversity of representation, but I would think that organizations want to retain the talent that they have and that they want to ensure that their employees experience well-being and belonging at work. And those metrics are also affected when they shift away from these more concrete strategies.
Such an important point. Thank you. Speaking of being very concrete and explicit about signals and our efforts, were any of these studies explicit about what the incentives for managers were? Or do we know anything about how study participants, either in the lab or in those real world organizations, what they expected the incentives to be?
We never were specific. So this was because in the field, which was the first study that we ran, our organizational partner helped us work on the language, and they had preferences about how we talked about the incentive. I think even with us, they were a little bit vague about what exactly would look like. My understanding is that it's basically a cut of year-end bonuses are contingent on this. So these executives can still get some of their year-end bonus, but not all of it, depending on how much progress they made. Um, and they did not want to get much more specific than that in conversations with us, and certainly not in the message to employees. And so then after that, we kept our other studies pretty similar, both because we figured that this is probably a preference that would be shared by other organizations. So in terms of being able to make a recommendation about what to tell employees, we wanted to model the kind of language organizations would be willing to use. And because it turned out that even when you're vague, this works. Now, I think there's a question about whether there's an incentive that feels wrong, that feels misaligned with people's feelings about how you should approach DEI. Uh, it doesn't, I think most people assume it's money, and that doesn't seem to strike a negative chord. I have a hard time thinking about what incentive would strike a negative chord, but I'm open to the possibility that there is one.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, someone just asked a question about whether we found either in your study or in other related work any differences between monetary incentives versus non-monetary incentives like recognition or awards or access to opportunities that you wouldn't otherwise have access to.
So in our studies, we didn't test any of these. And actually, I think one of the exciting next steps that we're hoping to pursue and that we're working on talking to organizations about is looking at the demand side and seeing whether these actually do work to change people's behavior towards women. Because so far we don't know. We know how women responded, but we don't know if managers actually then nominated more women for high potential programs or changed their behavior in any way. And so I think it's still important to see whether even just the financial incentive works. And in this case, for most of the managers who would be changing their behavior, they're not directly receiving the financial incentive. They're receiving a kind of symbolic incentive, which is the approval of their higher ups if they help them to achieve their goals. And so I think it's quite interesting to see whether that works or not. There is a really wide literature on incentive systems that I am not going to try to summarize today, but lots of different kinds of incentives can work and they have different pitfalls, and I encourage you to read more about them.
Yeah. Well, speaking of how different groups are incentivized, some folks here are curious about how men behaved or behave when diversity incentives are communicated to them. Are they less likely to express interest? Is there backlash? This question is coming out of the fact that, especially these days, diversity is often framed as a zero-sum game, which, as we know, is not necessarily accurate. Humans' zero sum beliefs are much more prevalent than actual zero sum situations, but those zero sum beliefs are very powerful in shaping our behaviors. So, what do you have to say about men's responses?
So certainly in our incentivized study, it seems like directionally men are less likely to apply when the incentive system is in place. So they seem to be definitely having these zero sum beliefs and kind of just as the incentive is operating as a signal that women's aspirations are supported, men seem to be interpreting it as a signal that their aspirations won't be supported or that they are less likely to get the management role. And so it's not worth the risk. I will say that when we ran scenario studies with men, we find much weaker effects than we did in that incentive compatible study. And it's hard to say which one would replicate what happens in organizations more effectively, because obviously in organizations, it's not all so simple. It's not a clean economic game where you're getting a bonus or not getting a bonus and calculating how risky it should be. Men, we know there's a confidence gap. Men tend to think they're more qualified than they are, and more qualified than equally qualified women. And so they might still be willing to express aspirations, even in the face of diversity incentives. We didn't measure potential backlash. What I can say is that we included the managers in our experiment were both women and men, mostly men, because 80% of the managers in this organization are men. And they didn't seem to be penalizing women in terms of their evaluations of women in the study, but we don't have long run data again, so I can't talk about how they behaved at later time points.
Yeah, no, but that's really interesting, though. Thank you for sharing. Do we know at all how women of different levels of experience might respond differently to the goals and incentive information? What might we expect from early career women who are 1 or 2 years into their careers overall or their careers at this particular firm versus those who are a little bit higher up, maybe have 5 or more years of work experience already?
Yeah, so our pool of non-manager women included women in their first year at the firm, all the way up to a very small number of women in their 12th year at the firm. So there were some women who'd been there for quite a while without ascending to a manager role and accruing any direct reports. Um, I can tell you what we expected and then what we found. What we expected was that these diversity incentives should be more powerful for women who have less of a strong signal, a less of a strong pre-existing, sorry, less powerful for women who have a weaker pre-existing signal about how they should expect to be treated in the organization. So kind of like the 2 by 2 that I showed you. We thought that the longer you'd been here, to the extent that you'd formed a negative perception of how likely you are to succeed from the fact that, I've been here 10 years, And for 10 years, 80% of the managers have been men. So for you, the signal should be more powerful. And if you've been there longer, you might be closer to the tipping point where you're just about qualified to be a manager. And so learning about the incentive should shift what could happen to you in the next year. And so we thought that the incentive would be more powerful in terms of shifting aspirations for women who had been there longer. We didn't find evidence of moderation by tenure. I can think now post hoc of countervailing forces that might explain that. But we pre-registered looking at tenure as a moderator because we thought that women who had been there longer would show a bigger effect. And we didn't find that. It could be that those women who have been there longer are more likely to be women who have simply decided that they don't want to ascend to management. Kind of to the point of the first question, there are some women, there are some men who have decided that that's not for them and that's not what they're interested in within their organization. And so maybe women who have been in their role or at their job stage for 10 years have simply decided this is where I want to be, this is where I'm happy. And so the message that kind of counteracted potentially the strength of the message for them, but I can't be sure. We just didn't find any moderation.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll ask one more slightly longer question and then a very, very short question at the
Okay.
end. What do you think, other than perhaps goals or incentives, or building on those, how might we hold companies' feet to the fire in terms of delivering or on their internal or external goals, right? And they're kind of whether those goals are concrete and numeric, or whether they're just aspirations to be better, do better, create fair organizations, create a level playing field for their talent. Um, what are some of the ways that we can make sure that companies stay on track with those aspirations?
I mean, one thing is that I think one of the reasons some companies are reluctant to share publicly their KPIs for diversity is because they're concerned about being held accountable. And I think what I would suggest is that we do hold them accountable, but if they're trying, hold them accountable gently. So give some rewards for transparency and some rewards for being willing to state what your goals are and to being willing to allow yourselves to be held accountable, but still say, you've only made this much progress, like where's the rest? How are you changing things? Now that you know that what you're trying hasn't been working, what's next? And one thing that we've been pushing for is to encourage more companies to engage in RCTs, because a lot of what's happening right now in organizations is that they're kind of not treating DEI the way they treat so many of their other goals, where they're willing to test strategies and determine what's effective and then use that and ditch the strategies that don't work. Instead, there tends to be this willingness to just pick whatever strategy everyone's using, like, oh, let's all use diversity trainings, and not see what works in this context for our organization, given the challenges that we're facing. And in many cases, what that means or what that should mean is running RCTs to see what initiatives are and are not effective. And I think if we push more companies to do that, whether or not they're being transparent so that we can explicitly hold them accountable for a lack of progress, at the very least, we should have the confidence that they're going to use strategies that work if they care about DEI. And if they don't, then it's a harder battle.
Yes, yes, I couldn't echo that message more strongly. The importance of testing what we're actually doing and seeing whether the results are what we expected them to be. So, my last question, speaking of results, did that company from study one achieve its 20, was it 23% goal or 25% goal?
It was to increase to 24%. Um, or sorry, to 23%, you're right. We don't know. So we have not received a follow-up pull of data from them. So I'm not actually sure how much progress they have made. And
Mm,
as they have not yet posted their end of year um, representation from 2024. So we do plan to follow up, but as of right now, I'm not sure.
that's fantastic. So stay tuned, everybody, and we'll all be watching those numbers keenly. Erica, thank you so very much for joining us today, both for your incredible presentation, but also for tackling these really tricky and detailed questions. And thank you to our audience for being so engaged and for submitting all those excellent questions. It's been wonderful to have you all here today. Next week, next Monday, is the President's Day holiday here in the United States. So we will be back with you for the next installment of our spring seminar series in 2 weeks' time on Monday, February 24th. And that day, we will be joined by Xia Wang, who's a WAP Research Fellow, and she will be discussing some of the themes around equal pay and incentives related to pay that we discuss in chapter 4 of Make Work Fair. Specifically, Shia's presentation is titled Setting Up the Gap, Gender Differences in Initially Salary Offers in Hiring. So we look forward to seeing you all then in 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much again for joining us today. And thank you, Erica.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sherry.